It's Ed Charbonneau and Sam Basu here, kicking off Blazing into Summer. We have a great lineup today. We've got Gill Cleeren, we've got Stacy Cashmore, we've got you, Sam, we got Beth Massi, and the one and only Daniel Roth. And we've got an entire day of Blazor streaming, which is an awesome way to bring in the summer, right?
Yeah, and let's not forget the Blazor expert in the house, Mr. Charbonneau, is here to play
Thank
host
you very
all day
much,
long.
Sam.
No lunch, no breakfast for you. Just keep going.
So let's not hold this up too long. We'll bring in our first guest now. We've got Gill Cleeren here. How are you doing, Gill? Welcome to
Hi,
Blazing into
Ed.
Summer.
Hi, Sam. Good afternoon for me.
I'm going to go ahead and give you the floor, Gill. I know
Yeah.
you have a great presentation set up for Blazor and what's new in .NET 8, kind of the render modes and how to work with those, and a little bit of Blazor overview. So I'll go ahead and give you the floor because I know you need a lot of time here. You've got a lot to cover. So I will see you in about an hour.
Yeah, thanks. All right, folks, and welcome to this presentation, which I indeed called Building Full Stack Web UI, Full Stack Web Apps with Blazor in .NET 8. So indeed, my goal, as Ed already mentioned, is giving you a bit of an overview of mostly the render modes, because they are what makes the full stack web development in .NET 8 and Blazor 8 possible. They have been confusing people a lot. There are definitely developers who are coming from Blazor with earlier versions. So I hope this presentation in the next hour or so will make that clear. My name is Gill Cleeren. I live in Belgium, where it is raining, and I also run a company called Exebia. We focus on the Microsoft services here in Belgium, so all the stuff around .NET architecture, and Blazor is definitely one of my favorites. That's what I do. I'm also a Pluralsight author for many years, and an MVP and a Microsoft regional director. So as said, what am I going to do? Just to make sure that everyone is on board with Blazor. Probably everyone knows Blazor, but I'll give you a 5-minute tour. So should you not have played with Blazor yet, this will give you a very high level overview of what Blazor is and what you can do with it. If you already know Blazor well, then you have 5 minutes to grab that last cup of coffee. And then we'll dive into the meat of the presentation, and that will be about the hosting models and the render modes. That's what I'll start with, to start explaining you what those mean for you as a Blazor developer. And I will dive into each of the different modes in a bit more detail. So I'll start with what has now become the default, so the server-side rendered components in Blazor. And then we'll look at adding interactivity. I'll start with the server-side interactive components. Then we'll move things to the client with interactive WebAssembly mode. And finally, we'll see how that combination kind of works, that auto render modes. And so after this, you should really understand what is now possible with Blazor. And so I think the goal of this presentation is twofold. Either if you're new to Blazor, you can understand what Blazor will do for you, what you can build with it, and you will start with understanding those render modes, because it is really a vital concept to understand what you can do with it, how they work, and what types of applications that you can build with them. And of course, for existing Blazor developers, I hope that I can make it clear to you what has changed, what has stayed the same, also what is gone, because that's also an interesting one, and of course what has been added into Blazor. So those are my two big goals for making that clear for both groups of listeners in this webinar here. And I just released, I think like 2 weeks ago now, a long course on Blazor, which covers pretty much every aspect of Blazor, and of course also goes in a lot of detail on those render modes. It's on Pluralsight, like all my courses are. You can find it on the link. I'll show it again at the end. But if you look for Blazor, it's in the Blazor path. It's a 7.5-hour course that will give you all the necessary details to start building apps with .NET 8 and Blazor 8. So that should also give you a lot more in-depth info. So with that out of the way, let us dive into a very short 5-minute tour of one of my favorite tools, and that is Blazor. And why not start that with a small definition. I think that's a good way to start it. This is a small definition that really captures in 2 sentences what Blazor is all about. So Blazor is a framework that helps us to build interactive web UIs using C# and HTML. And so interactive applications, interactive web UIs are really what we can build with Blazor, not just static web pages. We can do that as well. And we don't need any JavaScript for that interactivity. We can just use C# and HTML, which is kind of cool. And it also now supports server-side rendering and client-side interactivity. And that is, of course, also one of the big novelties now with Blazor in .NET 8, that it is now also supporting server-side rendering. And it is, of course, part of the ASP NET Core stack. So let us dissect that a little bit, and let us dive into that definition a bit deeper. So Blazor is a framework that gives us the ability to do 2 things. It can help us with building server-side pages, and it can also add client-side interactivity. That is definitely something that is new with .NET 8. It can also do server-side rendering. Again, that is one of the render modes, and it can add also client-side interactivity. So if you have been doing Blazor before, building interactive applications, using Blazor WebAssembly or Blazor Server, that mode is still supported, but now we also get that server-side rendering. Again, don't worry if you're not on board, we'll dive into that in much more detail. Now, the good news is that we are going to be writing C# code, and that same C# code combined with the HTML, the Razor code, that combines into components. And those components can now, with the logic indeed, can actually be shared between what we are writing or using on the client and on the server. So we can really take that same component and have it execute on the client as well as on the server. And no matter what type of interactivity that we're adding, we don't need any plugins to be installed. It is all based on web standards. That was already the case with Blazor WebAssembly. That hasn't changed. Now, Blazor is very flexible. It is the same application. We can use the same application code for web applications, but we can go even further. We can extend our Blazor code to also work for desktop applications. And I think there's going to be a talk later from Beth on hybrid apps, so we can also build mobile applications with Blazor. We're actually doing that for 2 customers. We've done it for 1, and we're doing it right now. It's really fantastic to have that same code base, use it in a mobile app, and have the customer be, wow, how fast can you build a mobile app? Well, it's actually the same application that we can now basically reuse in a mobile app, and that's really kind of cool. It also has all the benefits of Visual Studio. .NET, it is plain C#, it is plain .NET, so it means that we can use Visual Studio. I'll be using Rider because I'm on my Mac here, but it means that we can just use what we already know, both the code, both the tools, and we also get the same great performance and libraries. And you can go very far with Blazor. Like I said, you can build all types of applications, from static websites to web apps to mobile apps, and if you want, also get into games. Now, Blazor is part of the ASP NET Core platform. Platform, I should say, actually the ASP NET Core framework, because I say here that ASP NET Core platform is really the underlying infrastructure that we use across all the application frameworks. The ASP NET Core platform includes things like Kestrel, middleware, the Razor engine, model binding, and so on and so forth. And on top of that, we have the different ASP NET Core application frameworks. And so those frameworks, those include MVC, Razor Pages, Minimal APIs, and of course, the star of today's show, and that is ASP NET Core Blazor. So it is really on the same level as ASP NET Core MVC, and we can build applications with it. And of course, there are other smaller building blocks like Entity Framework that also are part of the full architectural overview of ASP NET Core. But let's not go there. Let us focus on Blazor. Now, everything in Blazor is really a component. We are going to be building components until basically the very end, because everything in Blazor is really going to be a component. That goes from a very small thing to a button, all the way up to a page. And it's going to be nesting all the time, because everything really is a component. If you think of a typical page, a button is going to be a component, a menu is going to be a component, and actually the entire page is also going to be a component. And those components we are going to write using C# and HTML. So there's really nothing really complex to learn when starting to do Blazor. When I do a classroom Blazor training, I always get the question from people, how can it be so simple? Well, that is really what Blazor is. You can really build something very quickly with the knowledge that you already have. And here is a very small sample component, the counter component you've probably seen it a million times, but this is really already or containing a little bit of functionality. It gives you the ability to click on a button, and that will increase the value of that button. But if you look at it, let's not talk about the functionality. It is really showing you that we can now write C# code combined with Razor code to have an interactive web application. And when we click on that button, that event down here at the bottom, or the event handler, I should say, that increment count will be showing, will be invoked. That will be updating the value of current count, and that current count will be updated. This is an interactive component. Again, we'll talk about that, but this is really showing you what a component looks like. It can be a small thing. This can be this counter, but it can be also a very complex form and that sort of thing. And Razor components really are used to capture everything in one piece, really. They are written in C# and Razor. They can be used to handle events, and they are also a unit of reuse. We can build libraries with components that we often encounter, but everything that we want can actually be placed in a library and therefore can also be reused. We don't have to put it in a library, but it's really the unit of reuse. So that should already give you a higher level overview of what Blazor is. And let's now look at, well, how do we get, let's say, to that full stack web development with Blazor? And then I need to explain to you the render modes combined with the hosting models. And that's really what I'm going to try to make clear to you. There are definitely some key learnings in this area that you need to grasp when moving to .NET 8 Blazor. So if you've done Blazor, you're probably familiar with what we already know as the hosting models. And the hosting models were pre.NET 8, let's say, pointing to how the .NET code, how the Blazor code was actually going to be hosted. Now we could choose between Blazor WebAssembly or Blazor client hosting model and the Blazor server hosting model. Those were the two hosting models. If you're not clear on them, I will show them in the combination with Blazor 8 in just a second. Now, with .NET 8, we moved into what is known as the render modes. While the hosting models are still valid, you can still talk about them, but now we actually talk about the render modes. And the render modes really will point to how a component is rendered. And that's really what has changed with .NET 8. Let me explain that in a bit more detail. So there are now 4 render modes, actually. The first one, and that is definitely probably the biggest novelty, is that we can now do static server-side rendering with Blazor components, also abbreviated often as SSR. And that static server-side render mode has now become the default and allows us to take our component code, put it on the server, and let it render HTML, which is going to be shown in the browser. And then we have the interactive server, the interactive WebAssembly, and the interactive auto render modes. So we have now 4 render modes. Let us look at them in a bit more detail. So it all starts now with that new one, that static server-side render mode. That is a new render mode. As mentioned, it is something that wasn't in Blazor before, and is now allowing us to have our components just render HTML on the server, rather than always being interactive and always rendering in an interactive mode, client or server. Now we can actually have our HTML be generated by our component, which executes on the server. So really what they're going to have is a request that goes to the server from the browser. The component's code executes there, and HTML is going to be sent to the client. Okay, we know that already. That is a regular request response thing that we're doing, and that's exactly what it is. Those components we can now take and let them execute in a request response mode. It's just the same as MVC or Razor pages. It is really stateless. And you can say, well, isn't that a step back? We're already used to spas and all that interactivity. And yes, that's true. But on the other hand, if you think about it, this is really fast. It's really lightweight because nothing has to run on the client. Everything runs on the server. And therefore also is really quick. And for some applications, nothing more is needed. If you think about a blog, if you think about maybe a shop or something, there's not a lot of interactivity, if any, necessary. So really, for those type of applications, static server-side rendering can actually already be enough. This is now the default in Blazor. If you start from scratch, this is what you now get. Blazor has now by default, let's say, gone to static server-side render mode. But of course, it wouldn't be Blazor if we could not add interactivity again. So on top of that static server-side rendering, we can add interactivity. And this is also changed from previous versions of Blazor, whereas previously we basically had to either be in WebAssembly or in server mode. Now we can basically sprinkle, let's say, interactivity throughout our application. On several components, we can say, oh, that component needs interactivity, but the other one doesn't need it. So we can now really, on a per component, on a fine-grained level, decide whether or not that component needs to be interactive or not. We can just enable that component to become interactive. And we have basically separate modes, several modes to make that interactivity. And interactive server, let's say, is a default one, which under the covers still uses the Blazor hosting model, so the original Blazor hosting model, meaning there is a signal R connection, and basically the application is going to be created per user, and that circuit is going to be set up. So if you look at that in a schema, again, think of the fact that this is only the component or components that you mark as interactive server. What is going to happen is that when you browse to these components, really what is going to happen initially, data is going to flow, the initial HTML, let's say, that is rendered by the component is going to fly over to the browser that is showing, but immediately a signal R connection is going to be opened. And so that still executes. What you see here is just basically the same slide that you would see with the Blazor server hosting model. Signal R connection is opened. When I click on something in the browser, information about that goes to the server, and then on the server, the changes are made to the DOM, and the DOM changes are actually sent back to the client and are shown there. But as said, we can now do this on a per component basis. We can also enable it for the entire application still, and that would then basically become a regular Blazor server application. We can also still use that interactive WebAssembly mode still. Again, we can, on a per component level, decide that a component needs to execute in the browser as a WebAssembly based component. We'll see this later in the code, how this executes, but what will actually happen is that a separate project will be created for these components that we mark as interactive WebAssembly, and they will be downloaded and will run along with the .NET runtime, again, as WebAssembly inside of the browser. So that is using the Blazor client or the Blazor WebAssembly hosting model under the covers. So when you mark a component or multiple components to be interactive WebAssembly, what really happens is that they are going to be packaged as a separate DLL, and that DLL is actually going to be downloaded to the client and runs from there with all the benefits thereof, because it doesn't need to download anything. It does not have any network delay. It goes really fast because it all happens directly on the client. So now we have already had static server render mode, the interactive server, interactive WebAssembly, and then we have also the fourth one, and that is interactive auto. Now, interactive auto combines the two other interactive modes, so the interactive server and the interactive WebAssembly. And I will explain later on how it works, and I will show it in detail. But basically what it does, it combines the best of the two worlds. And it will basically show first Blazor server, interactive server, and use the interactive WebAssembly download that in the background, I should say, and only when that has been downloaded, subsequent runs will use the interactive WebAssembly code. Really kind of cool. And actually can help you in building the best user experience. But we'll look at that one later, because it could otherwise be a bit confusing to understand. So how does this now all boil into full stack web UI? So as said, Blazor now, let's say, defaults to static server-side rendering. That is always there. And then you can say, like I mentioned, this component needs to be interactive using Blazor WebAssembly, and this component needs to be interactive using Blazor server. So I basically sprinkle interactivity all over my components where needed. And so this now enables you to build, using C# and HTML, a full stack application, a full stack web application, where you can say, well, these components run statically, so I can use that using static server-side rendering, and those I can enable with interactivity, and then I can again choose which render mode I want. So Blazor is now able to span the whole breadth, let's say, of components of render modes, and allows you to do wherever you render the components wherever you want them to be rendered. Now, of course, this is quite a big shift from .NET 6 and .NET 7. Coming from those versions, you will see, well, this has kind of changed, and it has changed, but under the covers, it also hasn't changed. You still see that it is still relying on what we already had, plus, of course, the fact that we can do things on the server now as well. They have changed, but also some things have stayed exactly the same. Blazor, the standalone WASM, that's a Blazor WebAssembly option, that still exists. And also not to forget, existing applications will just keep on working as well. You can, in fact, just change .NET 6, .NET 7 into .NET 8, and it will keep on working, even if you have a Blazor server application, which technically doesn't exist as a template anymore. So you can just update to .NET 8 with all the benefits thereof, and it will continue working. But of course, it's a good idea to move into what is now the default, and it is a new template, which is called the Blazor Web App. That's really the mother of all templates, let's say, for Blazor applications. This is where we will start now to build what we have available to us today. And as mentioned, the WebAssembly standalone template, that also still exists. And of course, we have the .NET MAUI Blazor hybrid apps templates also still available. So those three templates, they still exist today in Visual Studio. What has been removed is the WebAssembly empty, and also both Blazor server templates, so the server app and the server app empty. They have been removed. So it is not possible to start a new .NET 8 app based on the Blazor server templates. Again, doesn't mean that your Blazor server app that you have maybe built in .NET 6 or .NET 7 will stop working. No, but keep in mind, it might actually be a good idea to start using that new Blazor web template. That is now the default, let's say, for all Blazor needs, built in or default, let's say, to static server-side rendering, but then we can add the different render, use the different render modes, different interactive render modes on top of that. And that's actually my first demo that I'm going to show you. Let us look at that Blazor web app template, and let's start with just using that interactive, that static server-side render mode. So as said, I'm going to use wider here, and I'm going to use a new solution here. And as you can see, we're using .NET 8, and we basically only have the web app and the WebAssembly standalone app. This would basically create a WASM app that we can use, so this one, that we can use to create a PWA, so progressive web app again, but let's not go there because that's what we already had. This is what we are going to be focusing on, the new Blazor web app template. In Visual Studio, you have multiple windows. Here you can do that all in one screen. And so here in these settings, I can choose, and that's the important setting we need to look at here, that is the interactive render mode. And we will start with none. We will say, well, let's leave out all interactivity. I'm going to just use what is new, and that is a static server-side render mode. Let's run that already. And let's open in one go already the and it opens, of course, on the wrong window. So this opens, or this creates for me now a new application. Probably you've seen this thing before. It doesn't have the counter. If you think about it, it's normal. I'll explain why if you can't imagine it yourself. Let's open the browser tools first, and let's look at the network here. Notice that when I switch pages here, what is going to go to the server is actually a request, and a response is coming back. So this is going back and forth, back and forth. There is a fetch. Technically, this would be a get. Actually, Blazor is smart enough to intercept that and change it into a fetch, so that only that it actually just looks for the new HTML and pastes in the correct HTML. So it doesn't give you the flickering of the surrounding parts. So these parts actually stay the same. It is smart enough to know that only this center of the page, this welcome, has been changed. So really, this is HTML going over the wire. Every time I click here, this is now rendering a component on the server. That component renders HTML, and that HTML is being sent to the client. And that's exactly what I'm seeing here. Same model as MVC or raised pages here. Let's close that, and maybe if we look quickly in the program CS, that doesn't hurt. We see here that there is an add razor component that has been added here, and this is basically enabling that server-side rendering of Blazor components. And down here at the bottom, we have the map razor components middleware, and that enables to basically have server-side static server-side render mode enabled in our app. This is what has been new. But as said, we can now enhance that with interactivity. Let me jump back to the slides for just a second here. So we can enable, and of course we can do that ourselves. It's not very hard to do that, but we can also in the wizard also select the interactive render mode. We had set it to none, but we can set it to server, WebAssembly, and auto. So those make up for those three render modes that I haven't covered yet. And so the render modes really will change what has been added to the project. If we add interactivity, whatever type we use, then the counter will be added. And the counter, you probably also know from previous versions of Blazor, you can click on it. I'll show you in just a second. You can click on that button and it will increase the value of that counter. Why am I emphasizing that? Because that the tiny component is really what interactivity is all about. It can handle events. Now, where depends on the type of interactivity, but it is capable of handling interactivity, of adding events, capturing events, and executing code because of that event being triggered. And if we select interactive server, that will be processed on the server. If we, of course, select interactive client, this will happen entirely on the client. So this is that counter.razor that I showed you earlier already. Notice that this component has this render mode interactive server. I'll come back to that. And then it has C# code, and that C# code will now execute. And if we do an interactive server, that will execute on the server. So let us go back to right here, and let's do another new solution. And again, let's take the web app, and let us now say here that we want the interactive server mode. And let's do a create this window, and let us run it again. So there we go. Now we have that counter. Let's, before we do just anything, again, open here the browser tools. When I go to weather, go back to home, there's still that 200. So this is just using that static server-side rendering again. But now the counter will now use the interactive server mode. And as you can see here, it has opened this socket here. There's now a socket that is the signal ARC connection that is used so that when I click here in my browser, information will go over the wire to say, well, the user has clicked here, what needs to happen, and that information is sent back to the client, and then Blazor will paste that in the right place. It will automatically update. So important here is that events can now be handled here directly in my Blazor application, directly in the browser. And so when I go back here, and I'll go back, then you see that socket was still active. And we can, of course, the count has been reset, so all of that stays the same. Yeah. So now we have really added interactivity. And if we do the same thing, but now, if we now do another solution, but we now select Blazor client, WebAssembly, there we go. So now I'm going to use the interactive WebAssembly render mode and do the same thing again. Now, if you have been paying attention, you will already see that's an extra project now created. And it's called Blazor app 17.client, that project. Let's run that. And actually, let's make sure that we use the Blazor app itself. There we go. The web app is the main app. So there is still going to be a main app. Let's again open the browser tools. This stays the same. And when I now click on counter, lots of stuff will get downloaded. This is the .NET runtime that will get downloaded, just like we had with Blazor WebAssembly hosting model. This is, in fact, that hosting model that lies under the cover. But now we have used that as an interactive mode only on this component. So this only gets downloaded the first time that one of the components that has been marked as interactive client will be used. And you will see here, down here at the bottom, indeed, Blazor app 17.client.wasm. That's my application. The part of my application that is interactive, those components will be downloaded only when the first time we need them. And again, if we go away, clear this, and we go back into counter, you of course don't see that page, sorry, that WASM files need to be downloaded because they are already there. Yeah. So those are really the render modes in Blazor. That's what we now get. Now, this should already give you a bit of an idea. Let us now see how this fits into a real application. And I see there's tons of questions. Keep them coming. I'll try to answer as many as possible at the end of the talk. So let us now see how we can actually get this to work, let's say. How can we now make this or use this to in a real application? Well, I'm going to use the application I also use very often for Beth Massi Shop, in which I will show you the different render modes in action. And if you've never seen any of my Pluralsight courses, you might not know what Beth Massi Shop is. We'll get to know it in just a second, but I'm going to show you the different render modes inside of that application. And so we'll start with server-side rendered modes. Again, a Blazor component is really nothing special. It is now what we are going to use to execute code on the server side. Really, everything in Blazor is a component, and the thing that we're now going to do is rendering that component on the server in a static mode. That means that should I add a button and an event handler on inside of that component, really nothing would happen, right? Because the component has not been marked as interactive, so nothing is, let's say, listening to handle that event. Interactivity is not going to work. Yeah? So let us start with that. I don't need to show you anything extra because this is really, let's say, the default. Let me go to my demos here. Take this one. Let's run this. And this is of course opening in the wrong window. There we go again. So as mentioned, so this is my sample application I use for all my trainings and stuff. So Beth Massi Shop, she sells the most delicious pies, and her shop has now grown quite a bit, and she needs to manage her staff, right? So I've built a small HRM application, and we can click here on employees, and when I click here, it's going to take a bit. Take a couple of seconds, and then we see this page showing the 2 employees currently working at Beth Massi Shop, right? This type of page, as it stands, really doesn't require any interactivity. There's a details button. I will use the details page in just a second, but there's really nothing interactive happening. I don't need to change something in the UI when I click on something. So this page could actually be a static page because really there's nothing fancy going on here. And so interactivity might not actually be needed. So if we look at the code, there is this employee. This is the employee overview.razor. That's the component, and that contains some razor code, which is going to mostly go loop over this employees, which is a list, which we show in code in just a second. And for each of the employees inside of that list, I'm going to add a row to that surrounding table. And that's what we saw, right? The employees were actually coming from a fake data service, an in-memory data service that contains a list of employees. So those employees were loaded in the initialization of the component. That's really all that is happening. And since I don't have any interactivity here, it doesn't require me to do anything interactive. But let's run it again. And of course, I need to drag it over again. When I click on the employees here, notice 1, 2, and only then it shows. There's 2 seconds actually that we need to wait. Now we are rendering on the server. We are using server-side rendering, and I sort of say faked that the database was kind of slow, right? So let's go back to the slides for just a second, and let's talk about that. So now the user was actually experiencing this. I click in the browser on the employees, and really, although we don't have a database, the server is going to send a request to the database. And imagining that we have a flow database, it is going to take a while. And when the database is ready, then some HTML is going to be sent to the client. This is by default also the experience that we have with IVC or Razor pages. This is really the flow because everything happens on the server that we need to wait for it to execute, and only then will the user see something. So this has been, let's say, enhanced. We can enhance this with Blazor using what is known as streaming rendering, which is really, which is not interactivity to start with, but it's really, let's say, adding a layer on top of static server-side rendering. Enabled by Blazor, what we can do is send the user some initial content, like a loading or something, and the rest of the content that is being loaded asynchronously from a database will show up when it's available. So really, this is useful when you have a slow database call or a slow web service call, or I don't know what. You can already show some feedback to the user while the rest of the HTML is being streamed to the browser in the background. It doesn't require anything extra from my end as a developer. I can just enable it, and Blazor will do this for me. Extra content will stream to the browser over the same request. So really what is happening is the following. So I send again a request, and immediately I get back some HTML, some initial HTML, and I can show a loading, a progress bar, I don't know what. And behind the scenes, also immediately, the server is still talking with the database. That takes a while, and that extra HTML that has been triggered, let's say, also from the initialize code, will stream to the browser, and Blazor will put that in the right place. And so how do we do that? Well, we basically get something for free. This is enabled by a new JavaScript file that sits in Blazor that is already there by default. It's called the Blazor web.js. It is inside of the app.razor. And when we want this to happen, we need to mark the page with the, or the component, I should say, with the streaming rendering set to true attribute. So let's do that. Let's go back to the component, and so this one, and let's uncomment this here. There we go. And so this streaming rendering will basically let the code in the uninitialized async run in the background while already giving us some initial data visualization. Like I said, there is another thing that enables this. That is in the app Razor, there's this blazor.web.js that also needs to be there. Okay? It should be there by default. It comes with the template, but it also, if it's not working, make sure that JavaScript file is there. Let's see that in action. If we now go here, see, there's the loading, 1-2 seconds, and now the table is showing. Yeah? And this is basically the only thing I needed to do for this to work. And streaming rendering is something, let's say, get out of the box for free, which is kind of cool. And like I said, it's not interactivity. This is just giving the user a bit of a better experience by just enabling that on the component. Now we have a static page, yeah? But really, of course, it wouldn't be Blazor if we couldn't add that interactivity again. Yeah? So if we look at the counter again, what really jumps out is that we have the render mode at the top now. So as said, we can now, and that's also new compared to Blazor in previous versions, we can now enable interactivity on a per component level. So when I say render mode is interactive server, that really enables this component to be interactive. And that makes it possible for this component to handle events. I can now react to that on click that will trigger the event handling current count. That will change the value of current count. That will change the UI automatically. That's nothing I need to do manually again. This is just relying on Blazor like in the past. So by enabling Blazor, so your interactive server mode, the components can react to events. The UI will again update automatically. We don't need to do anything for that. And this is again based on that Blazor, on that signal arcs connection that we already talked about. So really what is happening when you mark your component to be interactive server, you will get back initial HTML from that component. But as soon as you hit that component from the browser, that signal auth connection will also be set up so that information about the event, the user clicked on this button, will be sent to the server, and the server will react to that by changing a component on the server side, and the changes to the DOM will be sent back to the client and will be updated directly inside of the DOM. So that is really what we now get for free. Again, Blazor server, but on a component level. Random mode needs to be set to interactive server on the component or components that you want to enable this. But if you forget to do a change in the program CS, you will get an exception, a runtime exception. We also need to bring in the right services in our dependency injection container through the add interactive server components. And then we also need to enable or use the correct middleware, and that is through the add interactive server random mode. These two need to be there before the interactive server mode can work. So let us go back to that demo, and let's go to the detail page. So on the detail page, where's my, over here? No. On the detail page, I have the, over here. I actually, maybe I should start by running it. I can show what is the result. So I have employees, so it's loading, that's the streaming rendering. And I can click here on details. That's a regular HTML button, nothing fancy schmancy going on there. But here now, I have a button that when I click it, will change the holiday state. So now Bethany is on vacation, and now she's back. Yeah. There's no form being posted or something. No, this is using the interactive server mode. Very basic example, but enough to make you understand that this is really using the interactive server mode. Yeah. I can continue changing that property of that employee type. How did I do that? Well, first things first, in the program CS, I brought in the interactive server components, and I also did this one here, the interactive server random mode. That is necessary. That's the middleware. Those two need to be there in order for interactive server to be enabled inside of the app. Then I have in my UI of my employee detail page or detail component now set the random mode to be interactive server. Yeah. This is now an interactive component, meaning it can handle events. Okay, fantastic. So that means that I can use a button, indeed. And on that button, I can add an on-click, which will be handled. And that's the change holiday state event handler in the code behind that will be triggering that will be triggered when I click that button, which is simply going to change the property is on holiday on my employee type to the opposite value. It's going to flip the value, and that is going to be reevaluate or trigger a reevaluation in UI of this block here, which is going to change. It's going to check the value of the is on holiday property of my employee, and based on that value, it's going to either show a different style and a different text. Right. So this is now interactive server, all happening on the server. And while we're talking about the server, there's another thing I want to show you here. Let me go here and let's go to another demo. And I'm on the Mac, so I need to use this one. What about the fact that we can actually do this with a data, because now I use data from an in-memory list. What about data from a database, right? Interactive server, just like Blazor server, fully runs on the server. That also means that we can use EF Core directly without any risk of leaking connection strings or passwords when talking with the database, because it all happens on the server, right? So interactive server can really plug into the to the server and to the database. So I have a different version of Bethany's PyShop here, which is going to get, you see it's a bit of a more advanced version. This time, there's only one employee, but this employee now comes from the database. It's a SQLite database I have included here. It shows a bit of a different UI. Again, if you want to know how that is built, this is also all in my Blazor course. But what you see here now is actually data coming live from a database. But that database I can directly connect to with EF Core. If we look at the code, you will see here that in the employee overview, the UI hasn't changed, but in the code, in the initialize this thing, really what I'm doing is I'm going to use a data service to get all the employees. And the data service is actually a class, this one, of course that's an interface, which is going to use a repository, as you see here, and that repository has a get all employees, that's the one we call, and if we look at that, that is actually going to use an AppDB context directly. Yeah. So I have an AppDB context of which I'm going to ask, give me back all the employees here in an asynchronous list. This is all running on the server, including my AppDB context, a regular regular database context, regular EF Core database context, which has DB set for employees, which is going to be mapped to my database behind the scenes. So this is really going to directly invoke data in my or get data directly from my database. That all works. Interactive server doesn't require anything. One thing here that I want to point out, for my data service, I did use an interface, right? I always do that, and it's I registered that here in the program CS, where I said here the employee data service I registered as a scoped instance for the employee data service. Keep that in mind because it's going to come in handy when we look at the other render modes. Just as a small tip. All right, let us actually go to the other render modes. So now we have seen interactive server. What if we want to move things to the client? Well, we can do that. We've seen that render mode already. We can, in fact, again, select to enable client-side interactivity. I should say WebAssembly interactivity because it's all interactivity on the client side. So WebAssembly interactivity on a per component basis. We can also, again, choose that this becomes the default on a global level, then your entire application will be downloaded. I'm not going to show you that, but that's possible. Everything will now be, or the components that you mark as interactive WebAssembly will now be rendered on the client and will be interactive from there. That's the idea here. Yeah. What is getting downloaded in this case, so the runtime, together with your application DLL or DLLs, because it can be multiple applications, you can have external libraries and so on. So that is really going to be downloaded. What is happening is that, we'll see it in the demo, your solution will now also contain two projects. The regular web app application still exists, but then the components that are client-side really are going to be in a separate project, a client project, a project of type Blazor WebAssembly. Again, a project type that you may already know from previous versions. So that is really what is happening here. It's going to be two projects, one that contains what runs server-side, possibly with interactive server, and then the interactive client part that is going to be, sorry, the interactive WebAssembly part is going to be a separate client project. That contains the component or components that you want to run directly as from the client as interactive WebAssembly. One thing to keep in mind here, if you have a nested component, you have a parent component with multiple other components. If you make the top component interactive WebAssembly, the nested component also need to have that render mode, or you can just leave it out and they will automatically default to interactive WebAssembly. That is important because the client needs to have all the components on the client side. With server, they are still on the server side, right? So that's how things relate here. So you see here a screenshot, I'll show it in the demo in just a second, that the client project already contains multiple components, the employee overview, plus also the employee card, which was that component that showed the employee with the picture, and a pop-up I haven't shown yet. But all the components that I nest inside of the employee overview need to be inside also that client project. So it cascades, it trickles down really. This we can do by enabling the interactive WebAssembly render mode. So that's what we use for that. And we use the add interactive WebAssembly components and the add interactive WebAssembly render mode middleware. That's what we are now going to do. So let's jump back to Rider here. And let's this time use the client-side version. You already see there's an extra project here, the client project. What I now have, these are not relevant to what we're talking about here, but the HRM, that's the web app, and the .client project, that is the Blazor WebAssembly containing project. That contains, if you look at the components folder here, multiple components. Actually, I need to show the pages here. The employee overview. The employee overview, and let me put it back to what it should be first. So I've marked this with interactive WebAssembly render mode, right? The code stays the same. This contains a table as well as the card UI. So this is just the same code. I've just switched it from render mode. I don't need to change anything yet. I'll come to what I need to change. This is now going to run on the client, and let me show you that. And by the way, notice that this nests the quick view pop-up as well as the employee card pop-up component. They are also inside of the client project, right? They also need to be there because they are nested inside of this employee overview, which I've now marked as a client component. Hence, they also need to move to that part. So let us run this. There we go. Same application. But now I should open the browser tools and let me clear the site data. There we go. Let's go to employees now. And there we go. See, now my application assemblies plus the .NET runtime were again downloaded the first time that I hit that component. The first time. Yeah. Second time, it's already there. It will use it from cache. If I clear the cache, it will re-download things. And it also contains that client project again. That contains my component or components in my case that will now render from the client. But it still looks like one application. It's a full stack web UI experience that you get. The user, you as a developer, you're just building one application that has parts on the server, parts on the client, making that all click with previous versions, having those things work together was actually pretty hard to do. It was possible, but it was pretty hard to do. Now it's actually a default experience that we're getting. So that's that. Now, what am I? Because I already mentioned, there is something that's a bit different though. Before I forget, in the regular web application, there is now the add interactive WebAssembly components and the add interactive WebAssembly render mode. That also is required in order for this to work. In the main web application, this is added. The client project is in fact a WebAssembly, a Blazor WebAssembly project. This is what you maybe you already used in previous versions of Blazor. This is, let's say, I shouldn't say standalone, but it's pretty much standalone project because it also has its own program CS, for example, right? And in here we again have dependency injection code data for this part, for this client part only. Yeah. Now it brings me to an interesting point here, and that is, what about the database? Because we used to have the database directly from interactive server that we could connect with directly. Now, of course, we're using WebAssembly. We cannot directly connect to that database anymore. Yeah? We should use an API instead, using either an HTTP client or the HTTP client factory that we call from our Blazor WebAssembly application. That solves that problem. We, instead of using a database, use an API. But that begs another question. I mentioned earlier, we can use the same components. We can use a component and just change the render mode, and it will automatically still work. Yes, but if you start bringing in a database, does that still work? Well, the way I put it up here, pretty much yes, because I put an interface that I employee data service, and that's the one I used for my component. And so what I've done is, instead of using directly my DB context for my component, I have that data, that interface, and I have a different implementation in my client and in my server project. Hence, I can basically swap when I want. So let me go back to Riley here, and let me show you the employee overview code. So the employee over code is the code is still the same. It uses still that employee data service through dependency injection to get all the employees. However, the client project has its own implementation of the employee data service. In fact, I also moved the interface here because otherwise I can't use it. So under services, I now have an implementation of the employee data service, the client employee data service, which doesn't use the DB context, but it uses an HTTP client to connect with an HTTP endpoint that I've now added in my Blazor web app. Indeed, over here in the program CS, I added a minimal API that says if you talk with send a request to API/employee, you will get back all employees using again that employee data service, but now using this one actually uses its implementation, which is registered over here somewhere, the employee data service, which goes to the database. So I have two implementations of my employee data service. One that goes to the database, which lives in the web app project. One that talks with the API, and that lives in my client project. That's this one here. So through dependency injection, by using dependency injection, I can leave my component code the same, and I can use that. I can reuse that component. I can swap it from project. I can drag it from the one project to the other, change the render mode, and it will still keep on working code-wise, which is kind of cool. And actually, this also brings me to the last point. And I seem to be running almost out of time. And that is the auto render mode. So the auto render mode is probably born by someone at Microsoft saying, should we actually have the user choose the render mode? Because, well, no, we can actually use a combination. In previous versions of Blazor, you were pretty much stuck with your initial choice, client or server. You could swap it. It was kind of a lot of work. Now you can basically use auto render mode, where you basically say to the component, you decide. Blazor, you decide how it will run. That's pretty much what it boils down to. So it will basically use, let's say, the best of the two worlds. Initially, the first time that you hit the component, it will use interactive server. But in the background, the runtime and the components itself, the component library, will be downloaded in the background. And the next time that you hit it, you will actually see the client component, probably. In a demo, it sometimes doesn't do what I want it to do, but anyway. So that's the idea. The first time you use the interactive server one, because that's the fastest to show something, because otherwise it might be slow downloading things. I'm local here, so it works kind of fast. But the user experience is initially, let's say, the best with interactive server. But then once everything is downloaded, we can use the client-side version. So that's the whole idea. So in the diagram again, initially, we will get a quick response because of the signal ARC connection being set up. And in the background, the application and in the runtime are being downloaded and will run from the client. That's the first time. So the user will continue using the Blazor server version until he or she has left the screen, has left the component. When they come back, they will actually see the client-side version. And nothing needs to be downloaded because that connection, that Blazor server connection, doesn't need to be set up again because we already have everything on the client. And so to do that, you use interactive auto. You don't need to add anything extra inside of the program CS. Yeah, you need both the interactive server and the interactive WebAssembly components to be in there, both in the dependency injection container as well as in the middleware. And that will be my last demo here. So let us go back to the component here. And that's so the only thing I need to change now is this. I'm going to just change it into interactive auto because of the fact that I already have also used my interface. I don't need to change anything in my code. Automatically, depending on the version that will be used, it will use either directly the database if we're using interactive server, or it will be using my API if we're using interactive WebAssembly. I'm going to run this by already adding a little disclaimer. This doesn't always work like it should in the browser. In any case, I should use a an incognito tab. Let's try that. This typically helps. And so I'm going to browse to here we go. And let me open the browser tools. So the idea is that you should see, if I browse to employees, nothing, that's not normal. I did a play overview, of course. What am I doing? I haven't done this demo more than enough to make a typo. So employee overview, there we go. I think it actually worked. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. So I hit this page and this component is marked as interactive auto. And now we're actually using the WebSocket version, so the Signal R based one. But in the background, you can see already that all the WASM files have also been downloaded. And if I clear things and I navigate away and go back, it again uses the client version. Like already the default bit client, it doesn't have to use that server socket connection anymore because it is using auto. It now has downloaded that in the background, but initially we were using that server-side rendered one. So it worked. Like I said, sometimes it doesn't show this correctly in the demo, but today it worked. So that's fantastic. So with that, I am almost done talking, and that's good. So I hope I explained to you the render modes clearly, because it is not something that definitely I also struggled with it when I've been doing Blazor for many years now, and when I saw this the first time I was like, "Ooh, well, things have changed quite a bit. They've moved my cheese," but in the end they haven't moved your cheese that much. You get more options. You can continue working like you were doing before. That's also quite nice. But with this added static server-side render mode, you can in fact also give the user a better experience, because not everything needs to be interactive. Only add it where it's actually necessary. That's the thought process that your application might go through. It's always the same code, and use dependency injection smartly to basically bring in different implementations and have the user either use the database directly or the version coming from using an API. So that is what I had to tell you. As said, I have this in a lot more detail in a full-blown application in my Pluralsight course. So if you're interested, look for the Blazor Fundamentals course, not the Blazor 6 Fundamentals, because we have left that up there as well. Because yeah, some people are still using Blazor 6, but this course covers the Blazor 8 model. And with that, I want to thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Gill. This was a great overview of the render modes in .NET 8. I know we've had quite a few people asking us at Progress about the render modes, so this should be a big help to those folks.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you showed off like the
Yeah.
two interfaces as well. Like one goes out to the database, gets the data,
Yeah.
brings it back. The other one goes out to HTTP client, brings that in. And you need both of those in order to do pre-rendering, and especially if you want to do the auto rendering mode, you have to have both of those things set up.
Yeah. The pre-rendering I haven't touched, but yeah, that is still something that you can bring in as an extra thing. But yeah, let's not make it too hard on people this morning. So yeah, that's another thing. Yeah.
It was great having you. Make sure you check out Gill's Pluralsight course. I've been running a banner for that at the bottom of the screen and posting the links in chat so people can find that nice and easy. And make sure you check out Technorama as well. Gill's an organizer for that wonderful event that happens twice a year. And it was great having you on the show. And we have Stacy up next.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gill.